It wasn't the Tommy guns. It wasn't the bootleg whiskey flowing through the streets of Chicago. It wasn't even the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It was the ledger. Specifically, it was a failure to understand the most ruthless arithmetic in history. Al Capone built an empire on violence. He bought judges. He bought police captains. He bought the mayor. He thought he was untouchable because he controlled the physical world. He controlled the streets. He controlled the ballot boxes. But he made one fatal calculation error. He assumed the sovereign state cared about morality. He assumed the government wanted to stop him because he was a criminal. They didn't. The government tolerates crime constantly. What the state never tolerates is a competitor for revenue. The mistake Capone made was not hiding the bodies. It was hiding the income. When the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sullivan that illegal income was still taxable, the trap snapped shut. The Frank Wilson investigation wasn't a moral crusade. It was an audit, and when the arithmetic didn't balance, the empire didn't just crumble. It was seized, liquidated, erased. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. We tell ourselves that if we follow the rules, we are safe. We tell ourselves that if we buy the right assets, we are secure. We tell ourselves that the money in our bank accounts is ours. But history tells a different story. A much darker story. Capone is just a microcosm. He is a small-scale example of a civilizational reality. When a sovereign power, whether it is an emperor, a king, or a modern republic, faces a solvency crisis, it does not negotiate. It changes the rules of the ledger. It redefines what money is. It redefines who owns what. And it does so with a speed and ferocity that catches the most powerful players off guard. This isn't about gangsters. This is about the life cycle of empires and the inevitable confiscation of wealth that occurs when the bills come due. The mechanism is always the same. First, the state overextends. Second, the structural costs of maintaining the empire exceed the tax base. Third, the leadership chooses a monetary shortcut to bridge the gap. Fourth, the currency dies. Fifth, the middle class is wiped out to pay the debts of the ruling class. This happens every single time. It happened in Rome. It happened in Spain. It happened in Weimar Germany. And if you look at the current data, you can see the exact same ledger forming today. To understand why your savings, your retirement, and your property rights are currently sitting on a fault line, we have to look past the headlines. We have to look at the accounting. The pattern repeats. The outcome is fixed. The only variable is timing and pain. To understand the true scale of this mechanism, we must look at the first great example of a superpower that tried to cheat the arithmetic. We must look to the Roman Empire. Most history books will tell you that Rome fell because of barbarian invasions. They will speak of the Visigoths and the Vandals of burning cities and crumbling walls. But this is a distraction. The barbarian invasions were merely the final symptom of a disease that had been eating the empire from the inside for centuries. The disease was fiscal. The disease was a government that could no longer afford its own existence, and the cure it chose was the systematic destruction of its own currency. The story begins in earnest with Emperor Nero in 64 AD. Before this date, the Roman monetary system was the envy of the ancient world. The silver denarius was the reserve currency of the Mediterranean. It was a coin of high purity, roughly 98% silver, and it was trusted from the foggy coasts of Britain to the deserts of Syria. A soldier knew what his pay was worth. A merchant in Alexandria knew that a denarius accepted in Gaul held the same purchasing power. This trust was the bedrock of Roman commerce. It allowed for long-term contracts for savings and for the accumulation of capital. But Nero had a problem. He had expensive tastes. He had built the Domus Aurea, the golden house, a palace complex of staggering opulence. He had to pay the legions to keep them loyal. He had to provide the grain dole to the citizens of Rome to keep them from rioting. And crucially, the Great Fire of Rome had devastated the capital, requiring a massive injection of funds for reconstruction. The treasury was running low. The tax base was stretched to its limit. Raising taxes directly was politically dangerous. It risked rebellion in the provinces and assassination. at home, so Nero chose the shortcut. He chose the hidden tax. He ordered the mint to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 98% to roughly 93%. He also slightly reduced the size of the coin. To the average citizen, the change was barely perceptible. The coin looked the same. It carried the same face of the emperor. It had the same legal tender status, but chemically, physically, it was worthless. Nero took the shaved-off silver and minted more coins. He created money out of nothing. It was a magical solution. Suddenly, he could pay the troops. He could rebuild the city. He could throw games in the Colosseum. The incentive is obvious. If you are the sovereign and you control the mint, the temptation to debase the currency is overwhelming. It feels like free money. It feels like a way to solve political problems without imposing immediate pain on the population. But the pain is not avoided. It is merely delayed and redistributed. For a time, the system held. But the precedent had been set. Once the taboo against debasement was broken, every subsequent emperor looked at the mint as a piggy bank. If Nero could shave off 5%, why couldn't Trajan shave off another 5%? Why couldn't Septimius Severus go further? The slide was gradual. At first, a slow erosion of value that took decades. But the arithmetic is merciless. As the silver content dropped, merchants began to notice. Prices began to creep up. By the time we reached the crisis of the 3rd century, the situation had spiraled out of control. The empire was facing civil wars, plagues, and constant border incursions. The costs of defense were astronomical. To pay for it all, the emperors accelerated the debasement. By the reign of Claudius, the second Gothicus, in 268 AD, the silver content of the denarius, now replaced by the Antoninianus, had collapsed to less than 5%. These were no longer silver coins. They were bronze slugs dipped in a thin wash of silver that rubbed off after a few exchanges. Think about the daily reality for a Roman citizen during this collapse. Imagine you are a legionary stationed on the Rhine frontier. Your contract promises you a certain number of denarii per year. When you signed up 20 years ago, those coins could buy a farm in Italy for your retirement. Now the coins you receive are worthless. The paymaster hands you a sack of metal that the local tavern keeper refuses to accept at face value. You demand a raise. The emperor, fearing a mutiny, grants the raise. He prints more bronze slugs. The prices in the tavern go up again. Or imagine you are a merchant in Antioch. You sell olive oil. You used to accept Roman coinage without question. Now you have to weigh every coin, scratch the surface, to check the metal, and demand 3 times the price you charged last year just to break even. You stop accepting coins altogether. You demand payment in gold or in goods. You demand bushels of wheat in exchange for your oil. The economy begins to demonetize. The complex web of credit and trade that bound the empire together snaps. The flight into hard assets became a stampede. Those who held cash, the middle class, the savers, the pensioners, were wiped out. Their accumulated labor was stolen by the state through the mechanism of inflation. But the wealthy? The senatorial class? They owned land. They owned vast estates. The latifundial land cannot be debased. As the currency collapsed, the value of the land relative to the currency skyrocketed. The rich got richer, not because they were productive, but because they held assets that were immune to the emperor's fraud. The social contract fractured. Why should a soldier fight for an empire that pays him in fake money? Why should a citizen follow the laws of a state that steals his savings? The Roman state responded with more force. Emperor Diocletian attempted to fix prices by edict in 301 AD. His edict on Maximal prices set strict limits on the cost of everything from wheat to beer to the wages of a camel driver. The penalty for violating the edict was death. The result was not stability. The result was shortages. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at the official price. The economy went underground. A black market emerged that was more powerful than the state. The complex urban economy of Rome disintegrated into localized feudal subsistence. The middle class priced out of existence, and taxed into oblivion fled the cities to work as serfs on the estates of the untaxed elite. The empire didn't just fall. It was hollowed out by bad arithmetic long before the first Goth climbed the walls. Just like the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries found itself in possession of a global superpower, a massive military, and a seemingly endless source of wealth that turned out to be a curse. The Spanish experience offers a different angle on the same pattern. Rome debased its currency because it lacked metal. Spain destroyed its economy because it had too much metal. It is a lesson in the difference between money and wealth, a distinction that modern policymakers frequently forget. Following the voyages of Columbus and the brutal conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires, Spain found itself in control of the richest silver mines the world had ever seen. The mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico began to churn out silver on an industrial scale. The Spanish galleons, the famous treasure fleets, crossed the Atlantic year after year, their holds groaning with bullion. To the Spanish crown, specifically under King Philip II, this looked like divine favor. It looked like infinite power with this silver. Philip could build the greatest navy in the world, the Spanish Armada. He could hire the finest mercenaries. He could fight wars in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France, and against the Ottoman Empire simultaneously. He could build the Escorial, a palace monastery of somber magnificence. He believed that silver was wealth. But silver is not wealth. Silver is a claim on wealth. Real wealth is the productive capacity of a nation, its farms, its factories, its skilled workers, its technological base. Spain used its easy money to buy everything it needed from abroad. Why manufacture cloth in Castile when you can buy it from the Dutch? Why grow grain in Andalusia when you can import it? The influx of silver made Spanish exports expensive and foreign imports cheap. The domestic productive base withered. Then came the price revolution. As the silver flooded into the Spanish economy, the arithmetic took over. The supply of money increased dramatically, but the supply of goods did not. In fact, the supply of goods decreased because domestic industry was dying. The result was rampant inflation. A pair of shoes that cost a few maravedis in 1500 cost hundreds by 1,600. For the Spanish peasant, this was a catastrophe. Wages did not keep up with the cost of bread. The cost of living in Spain became the highest in Europe. The middle class, the artisans and small merchants, were crushed between rising costs and the competition from foreign goods. But the crown did not stop spending. Philip II was engaged in a messianic struggle to defend Catholicism across Europe. The costs of his wars were staggering. Even with the silver of the Americas, the Spanish crown could not pay its bills. The silver flowed in one end of Spain and out the other, ending up in the pockets of Dutch arms dealers and Italian bankers. The state's response was to borrow. The Spanish kings borrowed heavily from the banking houses of Genoa and Augsburg, pledging future silver shipments as collateral. They issued juros, government bonds, which soaked up the remaining capital in the country. Instead of investing in a loom or a ship, a wealthy Spaniard would invest in government debt. It was safer. It paid a steady return. The entrepreneurial spirit was suffocated by the state's voracious need for credit. Then came the defaults. A monetary shortcut for Spain wasn't just inflation, it was the sovereign default. Philip II declared bankruptcy not once, but 4 times in 1557, 1556, 1575, and 1596. Think about the magnitude of that. The richest man in the world, the master of the Americas, stiffing his creditors 4 times in 40 years. Each default was a seismic shock to the European financial system. Banks collapsed, credit dried up. But for the Spanish people, the consequences were more direct. To make up for the shortfalls, the crown invented new and more rapacious taxes. They introduced the Milanesa tax on essential food items like meat, wine, and oil. The burden fell entirely on the common people, as the nobility and the church were largely exempt from taxation. The flight into hard assets in Spain took a specific form, the purchase of titles and land. Since commerce was risky and taxed, and savings were being eroded by inflation, anyone with money bought a title of nobility, A title conferred tax exemptions. It offered social protection. Spain became a nation of hidalgos and beggars. With nothing in between, the productive middle class was effectively abolished. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish Empire was a hollow shell. It still controlled vast territories on the map, but it was economically dead. The population had declined, fields lay fallow. The treasure fleets were still arriving, but the silver belonged to the creditors before it even reached the port of Seville. The chosen monetary shortcut, relying on resource extraction and debt rather than production, had destroyed the imperial core. The state survived, but the nation was broken. Just like Spain, the British Empire in the 20th century faced a crisis of overextension and debt, but the mechanism of its decline brings us uncomfortably close to the modern era. This was not a crisis of silver mines or ancient coin clipping. This was a crisis of paper promises and the slow, agonizing death of a reserve currency. In 1914, the British pound sterling was the undisputed king of global finance, as good as gold. A bond issued in London was the safest asset on the planet. Britain was the world's creditor. It owned the telegraph cables, the shipping lines, and the insurance houses. But World War I shattered the ledger. To fight the war, Britain had to liquidate its overseas assets and borrow massive sums from the United States. By 1918, Britain had transformed from the world's creditor to a debtor. But the political class in London refused to accept the new arithmetic. They wanted to return to the pre-war gold standard. They wanted to look the dollar in the eye at the old rate of $486 to the pound. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made the fateful decision to return to gold at the pre-war parity. It was a decision driven by pride, not math. The British economy was not strong enough to support that rate. To maintain it, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates punishingly high. This crushed British industry. It caused massive unemployment in the coal mines and the shipyards. It led to the general strike of 1926. The government was sacrificing the working class to protect the value of the currency and the reputation of the City of London. But the market always wins. The pressure was too great. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard. The pound collapsed. The illusion of stability was shattered. However, the real destruction of British wealth came after World War II. The war against Hitler had cost Britain everything. The national debt was over 200% of GDP. The empire was crumbling. The United States was now the undisputed master of the financial world. The British government, now led by socialists who wanted to build a welfare state, faced a dilemma: how to pay for the National Health Service, the housing projects, and the nationalization of industry while servicing a mountain of war debt. They chose the shortcut: financial repression and inflation. From 1945 to the late 1970s, the British saver was systematically liquidated. The government kept interest rates artificially low, below the rate of inflation. This is known as negative real rates. It is a subtle, invisible tax. If inflation is 5% and your bank account pays 2%, you are losing 3% of your purchasing power every year. The government is effectively burning your debt to pay its own. They also used capital controls. It was illegal for a British citizen to take more than a small amount of money out of the country. You could not buy American stocks. You could not buy Swiss gold. You were trapped in the sterling system, forced to hold a currency that was melting away. Between 1945 and 1975, the purchasing power of the pound sterling collapsed. A pound in 1975 bought a fraction of what it bought in 1945. The gnomes of Zurich, the Swiss bankers, mocked the pound. The International Monetary Fund had to bail out the British government in 1976, a humiliation usually reserved for developing nations. The flight into hard assets during this period was desperate. The British middle class poured their money into the only thing they could buy: housing. The obsession with property ownership in the UK is a direct scar from this era. When money is dying, Bricks and mortar are the only lifeboat. Consider the life of a clerk in London in the 1970s. He sees the price of sugar and bread rising every week. He sees the unions striking, the winter of discontent leaving trash uncollected in Leicester Square. He tries to save, but his savings account loses value every year. He looks at the wealthy elite. They have moved their money to the Cayman Islands or the Channel Islands, bypassing the capital controls that trap him. He realizes the game is rigged. The only way to survive is to borrow as much as possible and buy a house, letting inflation eat away his mortgage debt, just as the government lets inflation eat away the war debt. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1. The stability phase. The nation is productive. The currency is sound and backed by hard assets or strict fiscal discipline. Government debt is low. The economy grows through production and savings. Stage 2. Overextension. The nation achieves dominance. It expands its military reach, its bureaucracy, and its social promises. The costs of maintaining this complexity begin to rise faster than the economy grows. Stage 3. The turning point. The state faces a fiscal gap. It can no longer pay for its ambitions through taxation alone. Political leadership refuses to cut spending or raise taxes significantly, fearing unrest. Stage 4. A monetary shortcut. The state begins to debase the currency in Rome. It was clipping coins in Spain. It was debt and silver inflows. In the modern era, it is quantitative easing and deficit spending. The money supply expands. Stage 5. The inflationary illusion. Initially, the money printing creates a false boom. Asset prices rise. The stock market soars. Real estate values climb. The government claims credit for the growth. But it is not growth, it is currency devaluation, masquerading as appreciation. Stage 6. The awakening in flight. The population realizes the currency is losing value. Prices for everyday goods begin to sting trust in the sovereign debt waivers. Smart capital flees into hard assets, gold, land commodities, or foreign currencies. The middle class, unable to move fast enough, gets trapped. Stage 7. The reset. The system becomes mathematically unsustainable. The currency collapses or is redenominated. The debt is restructured, often through default or massive inflation. Wealth is transferred from creditors and savers to debtors. And the state, a new system is established, and the cycle begins again. Just like Rome, just like Spain, and just like Britain, current data suggest we are deep into this cycle today. Most observers agree we are firmly in stage 5, with flashing warning signs of stage 6. Look at the debt levels of the United States and the developed world. The U.S. national debt is rising by trillions every year. The interest payments on that debt now exceed the defense budget. This is the definition of the structural cost problem seen in stage 2. Look at the monetary shortcut. Since 2008 and accelerating in 2020, central banks have created currency on a scale that dwarfs the Spanish silver influx. The balance sheets of the Federal Reserve and the ECB have exploded. This is stage 4 mechanics in plain sight. Look at the asset prices. The stock market and housing markets have reached all-time highs, yet the real economy, the production of goods and services, has not grown at the same pace. This is the inflationary illusion of stage 5. Some economic historians note that the flight to hard assets has already begun, for the ultra-wealthy. Central banks themselves are buying gold at a record pace. Billionaires are buying farmland. They are positioning themselves for the moment the arithmetic resolves itself. There is counter-argument. Many economists argue that this time is different. They say that modern central banks have tools that Roman emperors did not. They argue that because the U.S. dollar is the world reserve currency, there is insatiable demand for it, allowing the U.S. to print without consequence. This is the same incentive that drove Nero and the British government of the 1970s. As for the reserve currency safety net, the British pound was the reserve currency until it wasn't. The denarius was the reserve currency until it wasn't. Status is not a shield against arithmetic. The endgame approaches in a fixed order, first controlled decline. The authorities will attempt to manage the inflation. They will try to boil the frogs slowly. Chaotic collapse. If the controlled decline fails, or if a shock hits the system war, another pandemic, a banking crisis, confidence evaporates. Supply chains break. This is the Weimar 1923 or Roman 3rd century model. The state intervenes with emergency powers. They may issue a new currency. They may introduce a central bank digital currency, CBDC, to lock down capital. They will default on entitlements or restructure the debt. This is the stabilization phase, but it comes at the cost of the old wealth. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. The only variable is timing and pain. Educate yourself on monetary history. Build resilience in your skills and your community. Pay attention to the data, not the rhetoric. The ledger always balances eventually. Make sure you are not the one paying the deficit.